She cleaned his house for 30 years. What the will revealed left. Everyone speechless. Welcome back and enjoy the story. Nanette never called it work. She called it taking care of the home. Not because she was paid well, she wasn't, but because there was something sacred, almost intimate, about keeping a home clean, organized, full of life, even if it wasn't her own. For 3 decades, she arrived every morning at 7:30 sharp with her cleaning caddy, a worn scarf wrapped around her shoulders, and a gentle good morning to anyone who bothered to listen. The rhythmic click of her sensible shoes against the marble floor of Samuel Edison's Chicago brownstone had become as much a part of the house as the creaking third step, or the way the afternoon light spilled through the stained glass window. In the foyer, Samuel's home stood tall and proud on a tree-lined street in Lincoln Park, its brick facade weathered but dignified, much like the man himself. A widower and retired federal judge, Samuel moved through his spacious home like a ghost, rarely occupying more than his study and bedroom, despite the 4-story splendor he owned. His voice, when he used it, carried the weight of decades on the bench, but Nanette had only ever heard it offer simple phrases. "Coffee's ready." Or "Thank you, Nanette." His silver hair was always perfectly combed, his suspenders always perfectly straight, his newspaper always folded just so when he finished, but his eyes held a sadness Nanette recognized, the kind that comes from living alone in a house meant for family. The residence had changed over the years. Children grew and moved out. Parties came and went. Guests admired the crystal chandeliers, but never noticed her polishing them to brilliance every Tuesday. She swept confetti after birthdays, scrubbed tears from bathroom tiles after funerals, folded clothes that didn't belong to her, dusted pictures of people who never knew her name. Some days, she felt like part of the furniture, present, useful, but ultimately overlooked. If you are enjoying the story, type 5 in the comments and subscribe for more videos like this. If not, type 0. It helps me create even better content for you. Continuing. Yet there was dignity in her work that Nanette never questioned. Her mother had cleaned houses in Alabama before her, and her grandmother before that. They had taught her that there was honor in making spaces beautiful, in creating order from chaos, in touching people's lives, even if those people didn't always see you. As she moved through Samuel's study, carefully dusting his law books without disturbing their precise arrangement, she would sometimes pause to look at the photographs on his desk. Samuel with his late wife, Evelyn, on their wedding day in 1963. Samuel receiving an award at the courthouse. Samuel with his son and daughter at graduations, both now living overseas, the daughter in London, the son in Singapore. Neither visited much. "Judge needs his space," Mrs. Whitaker from next door had explained once, when Nanette had asked. About the family. Always was married to his work more than anything else. Brilliant legal mind, they say, but never much for sentiment. Yet Nanette knew better. She had seen the way Samuel's hand would linger on Evelyn's photograph when he thought no one was looking. How he kept every letter his children sent in a mahogany box in his nightstand drawer. How he always made sure the guest rooms were maintained, just in case they decided to visit. There was a tenderness to him that others missed, a crack in the judicial armor that only showed in the silence of his empty home. One morning, Nanette arrived to find Samuel sitting at the kitchen table, staring into a cup of coffee gone cold. His shoulders, usually squared with the posture of a man accustomed to commanding attention in a courtroom, had collapsed inward. His hand trembled slightly as he pushed a piece of paper across the table. "My doctor says I have 6 months," he said without preamble, his voice steady despite the words it carried. "A year at most." Nanette stood frozen, her cleaning caddy suddenly heavy in her hand. In 30 years, this was the most personal thing he had ever shared with her. She set down her supplies and for the first time sat across from him at his kitchen table. "Have you told your children?" she asked softly. He shook his head. They have their own lives now. I don't want to burden them. What do you say to a man who has just shared his death sentence with you? Nanette had cleaned this house through divorces and deaths, through celebrations and sorrows, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. Yet as she looked at Samuel, truly looked at him, she realized how alone he really was, how alone they both were. Will anyone notice when my time comes? Nanette wondered suddenly, thinking of her own small apartment with its collection of ceramic birds and the single photograph of her son, Timothy, who had died in a motorcycle accident 15 years ago. The thought settled heavily in her chest, a familiar ache she had learned to carry alongside her cleaning supplies. What happens next will shock you more than anything you've seen before. Samuel's revelation is just the beginning of a journey that will change Nanette's life in ways she never imagined possible. The Invisible Woman is about to become the center of a story that will leave everyone in Chicago talking for years. Come. I'll come every day, Nanette said firmly, standing up and retrieving her caddy. Not just Mondays and Thursdays. Every day. Samuel looked up, surprised. That's not necessary, Nanette. I can manage. But there was a relief in his eyes that betrayed his words. He was afraid of dying alone, afraid of being forgotten. Nanette understood that fear better than most. I'll come, she repeated, and began her cleaning routine as if nothing had changed, though everything had. In the following months, something shifted between them. Their decades of quiet coexistence gave way to small conversations. Samuel would sit in the kitchen while she prepared his lunch, telling her stories from his days on the bench. She would share recipes her grandmother had taught her, or news about the neighborhood. They were small exchanges, but they bridged a gulf that had seemed impassable for 30 years. As Samuel's condition worsened, Nanette took on more responsibilities. She organized his medications, scheduled his doctor's appointments, and even coordinated video calls with his children, who finally began to call more regularly, their faces pixelated on the computer screen as they spoke to their father from across the world. When they asked who was helping him, Samuel would simply say, "Nanette takes care of everything," as if it had always been so. The house, which had once seemed so imposing to Nanette despite her intimate knowledge of its every corner, now felt different. She knew which floorboards creaked under her feet at night as she checked on Samuel. She knew how to adjust the heat to keep his increasingly thin frame comfortable. She knew which window to open just a crack to let in the spring air he loved so much. Have you ever known someone like Nanette or Samuel? Someone whose quiet dedication goes unnoticed? Or someone living in isolation despite their achievements? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Samuel's decline was swifter than expected. By autumn, he was confined to his bed, the walls of his world shrinking to the dimensions of his bedroom. Nanette moved a cot into the adjoining room, sleeping lightly, always listening for his call. His children had visited briefly in the summer, but their lives pulled them back to their homes across oceans. They sent flowers, they called, but they couldn't stay. "Read to me," Samuel asked one evening, his voice thin but determined. He gestured to a worn volume of poetry on his nightstand. Evelyn used to read this one. Nanette picked up the book, Tennyson, and began to read, her voice quiet in the dimming light. Samuel closed his eyes, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. This became their ritual in the evenings. Nanette reading, Samuel listening, both finding comfort in words that had outlived their authors. One morning in early December, Nanette arrived to find Samuel awake, but different. There was a clarity in his eyes she hadn't seen in weeks, a purpose in the way he beckoned her to sit beside him. "I've made some changes," he said, indicating a folder on the side table. "My lawyer has the documents. I just wanted you to know." Nanette nodded, not asking for explanations. It wasn't her place. She had long ago accepted the boundaries of their relationship, even as those boundaries had shifted and blurred over these last difficult months. "You were the only one who stayed," Samuel said softly, his hand reaching for hers with surprising strength. "You should know that matters to me." 3 days later, Samuel passed peacefully in his sleep, his hand still warm when Nanette found him in the morning light. The house fell silent in a way it never had before. Even in the years when Samuel had barely spoken, there had been the knowledge of his presence, the sound of his newspaper rustling, the clink of his coffee cup, the weight of his footsteps. Now there was nothing. The funeral was small but dignified, just as Samuel would have wanted. His colleagues from the legal world attended in their dark suits and somber expressions. His children stood tall and grief-stricken beside the casket. Nanette sat in the back row, a shadow among shadows, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Will Samuel's final testament reveal the true depths of their connection? As the legal proceedings begin, no one is prepared for what comes next in this emotional story of recognition, redemption, and the invisible threads that bind unlikely souls together. Afterward, the house stood empty. Dust gathered quickly on the furniture Samuel had so meticulously maintained. The plants began to wilt. The silence grew thicker, heavier, day by day. Samuel's children stayed for a week, sorting through his belongings with efficient detachment before returning to their lives abroad. The legal process began, the reading of the will, the distribution of assets, the slow dismantling of a life. And Nanette came back. Not because she was asked, because she couldn't bear to see the house fall apart. She kept coming every Monday. She watered the plants. She changed the bedsheets. She mopped the floors as if he might return from a walk. Neighbors whispered, "Why is she still going there? Isn't he gone?" But she didn't listen. Routine was comfort. The house was the closest thing to family she had left. One morning, as she cleaned the study, carefully wiping dust from the spines of law books that would never again be opened by their owner, the doorbell rang. The sound echoed through the empty house, startling in its normalcy. 2 people stood. Outside, a man and a woman, both in suits, both carrying briefcases. The woman spoke first. "Nanette Pereira?" She nodded, confused. Few people knew her last name. Samuel had always just called her Nanette. "We're here regarding the last will and testament of Samuel Edison," the man explained, his voice carrying the practiced neutrality of someone accustomed to delivering life-changing news. "May we come in?" They sat her down in the living room, the same room she had vacuumed countless times without ever sitting in its plush chairs. The formal space had always intimidated her with its perfect symmetry, its gleaming surfaces, its air of untouchable elegance. Now she perched uncomfortably on the edge of a brocade sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "There have been some complications with the will," the woman, Ms. Harlow, she'd introduced herself, explained, producing a folder of documents. "Judge Edison made some significant changes shortly before his death." Nanette's heart sank. She had no claim to anything in this house, of course, but she had hoped to be allowed to continue caring for it until it was sold, to have a few more weeks or months in these familiar rooms before saying goodbye. "Is this a mistake?" she asked, as Ms. Harlow handed her a document with "Bequest to Nanette Pereira" written in bold across the top. They shook their heads in unison. "No mistake," Mr. Marshall, the other lawyer, confirmed. He cleared his throat, clearly moved despite his professional demeanor. Judge Edison was of sound mind when he made these changes. Very sound mind, according to his physician. Nanette looked down at the paper in her hands, the words swimming before her eyes. Samuel had left the entire house to her. The house she had cleaned for 30 years. The rooms she knew better than her own, the place where she had cried silently when Timothy died, and still came to work the next morning because grief doesn't pay the bills. the home where she had nursed Samuel through his final days, reading Tennyson in the gathering darkness. In his letter attached to the legal documents, Samuel wrote, "Nanette, you were the only one who never left, the only one who remembered Evelyn's birthday when even I sometimes faltered, the only one who brought warmth when everything else grew cold. You never asked for more, but you gave more than anyone. This house was never truly mine. Not really. It was alive because of you. And now it belongs to you." She couldn't stop crying, not because of the inheritance, not because of the title, but because someone had finally seen her, really seen her. After decades of invisibility, of existing in the periphery of others' lives, she had been acknowledged, recognized, valued. When the lawyers left, promising to return with more paperwork to finalize the transfer, Nanette walked through the house differently. Not like a worker, not like a guest, but like someone returning home after a long journey. She touched the walls she once washed with vinegar and care. She ran her fingers along banisters she had polished thousands of times. She stood in the center of rooms she had only ever occupied, as a transient presence, feeling the solid floor beneath her feet, the space around her, the permanence of belonging. That evening, she sat on the front porch in the golden light of sunset, clutching Samuel's final letter to her chest. Chicago moved around her, cars passing, neighbors walking dogs, children riding bikes on the sidewalk. The world continued, as it always had. But Nanette's place in it had fundamentally changed. Later, she opened all the windows, let in fresh air, new beginnings. The house seemed to exhale, to shake off the stillness of grief and vacancy. And she decided something. She wouldn't sell the house. Instead, she would transform it into a center for elderly women, women like her, who had worked their whole lives and were always told to be quiet, invisible, polite. Women who had cared for others but rarely been cared for themselves. She called it the Quiet House, in honor of all the voices that had never been heard. The name was a tribute to Samuel, too, to his reserved nature, his dignified silence, and ultimately his profound act of recognition. Women came. They read books in the sunroom, where Samuel had once sat alone with his thoughts. They took naps in rooms Nanette had once dusted. They shared stories over tea at the table where no one had ever invited her to sit. They planted a garden in the backyard, their aged hands working alongside Nanette's, breaking earth that had lain untouched for years. The children's empty bedrooms became comfortable living quarters. Samuel's study, with its imposing desk and wall of law, books became a library where women learned to read, wrote their memoirs, or simply sat in companionable silence. His bedroom remained untouched for a time, a quiet memorial, until one day Nanette realized Samuel would want it used by someone who needed rest. City officials were skeptical at first. Zoning laws, permits, regulations. But Samuel's reputation still carried weight, and his former colleagues in the legal world helped Nanette navigate the bureaucracy. Perhaps they were motivated by guilt, by the recognition of a woman they had passed in hallways for years without truly seeing. Perhaps by admiration for Samuel's final act of justice. Either way, the Quiet House received its official designation as a community center, and Nanette's vision became reality. As spring returned to Chicago, bringing green to the trees that lined the street outside, the Quiet House bloomed with life. Laughter echoed through rooms that had known too much silence. Music played from an old record player Nanette found in the attic. The kitchen, where she had once prepared solitary meals for Samuel, now bustled with activity as women cooked together, sharing recipes and stories from their lives. Nanette found herself at the center of a community she had never expected to have. Women who had been housekeepers, nurses, factory workers, teachers, all with stories of invisibility, all with wisdom earned through years of quiet observation. "I cleaned for a family for 42 years, said Dorothy, a woman with cloud-white hair and hands gnarled from decades of labor. "When the children grew up, they couldn't remember a time before I was there. But when they sold the house, they gave me a watch and a card, like I was retiring from an office job, like I hadn't raised them alongside their own mother." Nanette nodded, understanding perfectly. "Were you angry?" she asked. Dorothy considered this, her eyes distant with memory. "For a while. But then I realized they couldn't see what they had never been taught to look for. Their blindness wasn't malice, it was the way of the world." "Not anymore," Nanette said firmly. "Not here. The final chapter of our story draws near. Will the quiet house fulfill its promise of redemption? Has Nanette truly found her purpose after decades in the shadows? Keep watching to discover how this extraordinary journey concludes. Samuel's children visited that summer, curious perhaps about what had become of their childhood home. They arrived with uncertainty in their posture, standing awkwardly on the porch where they had once played as children. Nanette welcomed them warmly, without resentment. They had been part of Samuel's life, and that made them important to her story too. "He talked about you," the daughter, Ellen, said as Nanette showed them around the transformed house. "In those final months, he said you were the heart of this place." Nanette accepted this with a small smile. "He was a good man," she said simply. "He just needed someone to see it." Before they left, they gave her a small wooden box, the one Samuel had kept his children's letters in. "Dad would want you to have this," the son explained, "for the quiet house, for its history." That box became the first item in what would grow into a museum of ordinary lives, a collection of mementos from the women who found sanctuary in the quiet house. Handwritten recipes, wedding photographs, work uniforms, pay stubs, objects unremarkable to the casual observer but sacred to those who understood their significance. And every Christmas, Nanette handed each resident a card that read, "To you who keeps the world alive." Because now she knew love doesn't need applause. Sometimes it just needs to be remembered. 5 years after Samuel's death, as Nanette sat on the front porch watching summer twilight settle over Chicago, a young reporter from the Tribune came to interview her about the quiet house. It had gained a reputation by then, a place of dignity and purpose, a monument to lives often overlooked. "What made you create this place?" the reporter asked, her pen poised over her notebook. Nanette considered the question carefully before answering. "I spent decades being invisible," she said finally, "moving through people's most intimate spaces without being seen, caring for their homes, their possessions, sometimes even their families. But one person saw me, really saw me, and that changed everything." She gestured to the house behind her, the sturdy brick, the gleaming windows, the warm light spilling onto the porch where they sat. "This place is about being seen," she continued, "about recognition, about the sacred nature of care, about the dignity in work often deemed unimportant. It's about all of us who have kept the world running while remaining in the shadows." As twilight deepened into evening, the women of the quiet house gathered on the porch, bringing out glasses of lemonade, settling into rocking chairs, their voices blending in comfortable conversation. The reporter watched them, her pen moving quickly across the page, capturing a story of transformation, not just of a house but of lives. Later, as stars appeared in the Chicago sky, Nanette stood in Samuel's study, now the library, and looked at his photograph on the wall. She had kept it there, alongside portraits of all the women who had found home in the quiet house. "We did good," she whispered to him. "We made something beautiful." And in the quiet of the room, surrounded by books and memories, Nanette felt a sense of completion, of coming full circle. The invisible woman had not only been seen, She had created a place where others like her could step into the light, where their stories could be told, where their lives could be honored. It was more than a house now. It was a testament, a legacy, a home. Congratulations, type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel.